thank you. So again, my regards to everybody in Washington today. You can go ahead and go to the first slide, please. So basically, we compared three concurrent implementations. The first was a traditional probability-based survey. So this will be abbreviated in the tables as TPS. And these were the high-cost, high-quality, high-response rate surveys conducted face-to-face via telephone by mail. Second, we compared the first probability web panel in Slovenia, the 1KA panel. This could be abbreviated as PWP, the tables, and we also compared the largest Slovenia's non-probability web panel, Valicon, and this will be labeled as NWP. Please go to the next slide. So this panel that was established, the 1KA panel in 2022, is the first probability panel in Slovenia. We used incentives for recruitment and unconditional incentives for each wave. Overall response rates were 35% at recruitment and 16% in the last wave. This panel will be explained by Jacek tomorrow morning in session number 8. So we compare estimates from 6 waves today, which we will detail later. So please go to the next slide. Before I get to the results, I would just like to explain that our basically primary criterion is the relative bias. We'll also always have considered the absolute value of this bias. We compared approximately 2,600 variables. We weighted all the estimates, and this was split into 2 segments. So segment A included 14 surveys, and these were fielded simultaneously in all 3 implementations. And the second segment of 17 surveys was conducted only in both types of panels. Due to the large numbers of variables, we will report the results as the share of the variables that have a relative bias over 10%. So this above 10% was the threshold that we used. Please go to the next slide. So this is just the list of surveys which were included as the basis for the study. If you're interested in this later, but for now, please go to the next slide. I wanted to get the results quickly so I can just explain the layout. So on the left-hand side, we have the list of the surveys. And then in the middle column, we compare the probability web panel with the traditional survey. And here we report the share of variables with relative bias over 10%. And in the right-hand column, we compare the non-probability web panel with the probability panels of both types of panels. Then here the share is listed. So for example, the first survey related to work and living conditions. Here we see that 14% of variables in the probability web panel had a bias over 10% compared to the traditional survey. Both types of panels were compared. This was 4%. And then we also have the count, the variable count, so how many variables were analyzed. So this first survey is an example where bias was modest in both comparisons. Maybe some similar examples would be the tobacco, alcohol, and other drug use survey and attitudes toward mental health. But of course, we have some opposite examples where there was high level of bias in basically all types of comparisons. The most obvious one is the living conditions survey. This was conducted both at the personal level and household level. So here we see that the share of variables with bias over 10% was 40 or even 60%, depending on which comparison you look at. At the bottom, we have the median bias. So for the probability panel compared to the traditional surveys, on average, 33% of variables had relative bias over 10%. So this is total over these 1,200 variables. So surprisingly, it was rather high. It was also higher than the mean level of bias when we compared both types of panels. Please go to the next slide. So here I would like to talk about the second segment. Here we just compared both types of panels. And some surveys here stand out, for example, providing assistance to the elderly, which is a more maybe sensitive or specific topic. ICT use, which included e-learning and elections and referendums. Here, the level of bias was basically very high. What's interesting about the elections, for example, was that when we asked about politics in general, so their opinions or how they view politics, their interest in politics, 20% of variables had relative bias over 10%. So this is basically almost doubled when asked about election turnout and how they voted. But on the other hand, when we asked about e-voting, so online voting, this was the opposite. So the bias here was actually lower, which could be related to what I will talk about next, where the panelists somehow differ from the otherwise general populations in the traditional survey. So please go to the next slide. So now I would like to maybe explain how the respondents are different. Basically, we start in the traditional probability survey, then we progress to the probability panel, and finally we progressed to the non-probability panel. So along this progression, we saw some stable patterns that we would like to explain. So respondents became increasingly less happy and satisfied with life. They also scored lower when they were asked if they would trust strangers. They would be increasingly dissatisfied with the economic situation. This could be related to the last 2 points here. We found that fewer had fixed-term employment contracts, and they would more often live in multi-apartment buildings. They were also more politically active along this progression and were left-leaning, decreasingly religious, and they would report traveling more quickly. Please go more frequently. Please go to the next slide. So furthermore, here we see that, these long-term health issues were interesting. So the statistical office has a question. They first ask, do you have a health condition? And there is the follow-up, is this a long-term health condition? So usually it's 6 months or more. And we found that panelists would increasingly report these types of long-term issues. They would be also increasingly dissatisfied with the Slovenian education and healthcare systems. They would become less supportive of EU and migration. Fewer would report that they are immigrants themselves. Increasingly, they would be belonging to groups that suffer from inequality. Fewer of them would be members of unions, and they would feel less responsible personally for mitigating climate change. Please go to the next slide, and I think my 2 minutes, yes. To conclude, some remarks. As I mentioned, we were a bit surprised that the bias was rather high between the traditional surveys and the probability panel, and also higher than when we compared both types of panels. We found that, at least for official statistics topics, this cost-benefit advantage that panel gives us in terms of allowing for a larger sample size for the same price, this would rarely offset the higher bias. On the other hand, there were differences, large differences by subject area. So for certain topics, bias is not such an issue. We, of course, saw that attitudes would perform better in panels compared to behaviors or facts. So please go to the next slide. This is the last one. So just some limitations. Neither of the panels had an offline mode, and we weighted all the variables for the entire population. So this would be a disadvantage to the panels. The benchmark we chose, so relative bias over 10%, may be very arbitrary. So usually you would want to also consider time costs and other variables. So maybe some caution here is needed. And also, of course, our variables are specific to official statistics. They are, of course, related to also social sciences, but our starting point was the official statistics comparison. So just go to the final slide, please. I will conclude my presentation here, and thank you for allowing me to participate in the conference.